So I told you that we would do a recorded lecture for Chapter 9 on job security and seniority. I apologize if you hear my daughters and or their cartoons in the background of our video, but I'm home this morning, sort of preparing this for you guys. So these two factors, job security and seniority, really behind wages and benefits are one of the major issues when it comes to collective bargaining agreements. Regarding job security, the union's wishes and labor organizations' wishes for, making sure that they have a stable job and a stable income have really never waned. When you think about these particular issues, there's a lot that we're going to talk about within this chapter. So definitely the issues of job security, which is also called industrial jurisprudence, another fancy word for, an issue that we're familiar with. Matters of seniority and tenure, how we calculate seniority, promotions, layoff and recall rates, mergers, talk a little bit about alcohol and drug testing, and then just a little bit about social media usage as well. Those are kind of things that go mostly with disciplinary procedures. What were to happen if, an employee within an organization were to get in trouble for something like that, that the contract needs to, obviously protect them as long as they are, within their rights as an employee. So, like we talked about, job security is, definitely a big idea. But there's a lot more to this idea of job security than just the guarantee of work. We talked about on Wednesday issues of what happens when there's downsizing or a layoff within the organization. What happens when we have to recall employees after they've been laid off with the organization, and then what happens if they need a fair hearing during a disciplinary case. So again, this concept of job security, when we talk about these issues, basically just like any other benefit, any other thing that's going to be negotiated within the contract, the issues of job security, again, are mandatory bargaining items. So when we talk about laying things out for the contract, we really are just trying to make things as specific as possible, set those rules and regulations. What happens in the instances of a layoff or a downsize or a merger? There's a lot of anxiety when it comes to this idea of employees potentially losing their jobs or having their jobs transferred or moved. In terms of the contract, we want to be able to dispel some of that anxiety and some of that stress that goes along with these issues. So this is definitely a major concept when it comes to conflict that has to do between labor and management. Management and the organization, they want to pretty much have a free hand in how they operate the organization, meaning that if they want to downsize, they want to lay off, they want to outsource specific jobs for either financial reasons or manufacturing reasons, that they want to be able to do that. They want to have the power to do that. But unfortunately, we have this conflict because employees, they want to, have protection. And that's one of the reasons why they developed a union in the first place, is to really have a voice in that decision making, to have the power of numbers, and to, really perceive that they have a safe job to go to. I often tell my students a lot about, I talk about my own family a lot and use examples, but my grandfather had worked for the railroad for his entire life, and that relationship between him and his employer, which at the time was Conrail, he perceived and, talked about the fact that he had job security there, that unless there was something crazy that happened, that the employer was going to take care of him, really for, his entire working life, and his entire professional life. And that's really what happened. The employer would invite him over to his house, for, holiday dinners and picnics and things like that. And it was really definitely a different kind of relationship. We mentioned a little bit on Wednesday, our presenters mentioned a little bit about employment at will. We'll definitely talk about that. But that is a different scenario. Realizing that Pennsylvania is an employment at will state, there's really no guarantee to a job. The organization at any time, can decide to let you go. But it goes both ways. At any time, you can decide to leave that organization as well. So it gives the flexibility of both parties in the relationship, but it also, leads to potentially a little bit of anxiety in terms of where the organization is and what decisions they need to make. So some of the issues with these ideas of seniority, seniority is definitely a big issue when it comes to job security. I've told you guys, talked about a few examples of seniority when it comes to my mom's work in the post office, having worked there for a number of years, and finally, after 30 years, actually just getting a job that she really, really likes, and a day-late job at that. So when we talk about seniority, it's really just laying out, again, some of the rules, the procedures, and how we allocate specific jobs, including promotion, job bidding, layoff and recall, and everything is based upon length of service. So even calculating seniority lists down to the day is something that is very, very common within an organization. And every employee would know, and every manager would know where people fall within that seniority list. So typically you're very familiar with who is right above you and who is right below you on that list based upon length of hire. A couple other things that are, prevalent when it comes to this idea of seniority and job security. Back in the late 1930s, we actually started this procedure called last hired, first fired. So in the case of a layoff or in the case of a downsize, that the last people that were hired within the organization were typically the first to go. And that really kind of coincides with this idea of seniority. They don't have as much tenure, they don't have as much experience. And so with that increased tenure, with that increased experience, you have knowledge of the organization. And if you think about human capital theory and, what people gain in terms of, the knowledge and the experience, when you think about human capital as your people as your asset, then it makes sense to keep the people that have the longer tenure, the more experience, and the more knowledge about the organization. So that those kinds of things are actually lost if you decide to lay off your senior employees, which would be the ones with the most seniority or the most tenure in the organization. So there are some theories, there are some things when we talk about management that actually support this idea of using seniority systems, but we'll also talk about what happens when we look at things like actual performance. So actual performance and using a very clear seniority system are very much two different things. It may be that your senior, most tenured employees are your highest performers, but that might not always be the case. And so what does the organization want to do? Does it want to protect those that perform the best, that are the hardest workers, that are the most determined, innovative employees, that the organization has? Or does it want to protect the ones that have been there the longest? So seniority is really a measure of this idea of employee job security. And one of the reasons that we use seniority is because it's really the easiest thing to define and measure. It's much easier to measure seniority than it is to measure performance. Seniority basically, when it comes down to it, is just the number of days that you've been with the organization. Sometimes that's calculated literally in days. So, it might be, you look at seniority over somebody's 30 years, right? It's thousands of days that we calculate that seniority. But that seniority is much easier and more, easier to define and measure than something like performance. If you want to measure performance, you've got to do a performance appraisal. Performance appraisals are biased. They have all sorts of issues and challenges with them. It's not to say that they're not used in organizations, because they are. Most for-profit, non-for-profit organizations that are non-unionized are going to use a performance appraisal process. I'm not sure if anyone has ever been part of a performance appraisal process, but it's pretty labor-intensive. Think about doing an appraisal on every every employee that you manage. And they're very challenging. They're very difficult. If you take a human resources class, you would talk specifically an entire chapter probably on performance appraisals. You could take entire classes on performance appraisals. So it's a very labor-intensive, difficult process. Seniority is not something that's required by law, and it's not really an inherent right of employees either. But it is something that is a mandatory subject within a collective bargaining agreement and within a negotiation. So if employees want to bring up issues of seniority, if management wants to bring up issues of seniority in a negotiation, it has to be bargained. The other side has to say, okay, we'll come to the table and discuss it. So how do we calculate seniority? New employees generally begin acquiring seniority on the date of hire. And so when it comes to, and again, I'm going to use my mom as a lot of examples for this, but she was actually hired with a group of employees. So they all went through kind of the civil service testing together. They all passed the civil service test. And at that time, the post office, this was back in the 80s, the early 80s. My mom started working at the post office when I was 6 years old, and she's been working there ever since, so it seems like forever. But the way that her seniority was calculated was, again, down to the day. And there are other people, because she was hired in a group, there are other people that have the same seniority as she does. So when it comes down to seniority lists and job bidding and things like that, the post office, because people share the same seniority, really the same exact days of length of tenure with the organization, they have to base some of those decisions when it comes to promotion and job bidding on performance. Thankfully, my mom is a very hard worker. She's very few times said no to something that the post office has asked her to do. And so, her performance and her kind of commitment to the organization has helped her, in terms of getting those lateral moves or, getting those promotions. So that's definitely a good thing. And basically when it comes down to, again, that seniority list, there's a lot of different ways that we can calculate that. So when it comes down to plant-wide seniority, this is like looking at the entire organization as a whole. In the instance of my mom, it would be looking at everybody that works within the Duncansville plant. My mom works at the Annex plant in Duncansville. And everybody receives credit for the amount of time that they have worked at that particular plant. Departmental seniority is basically calculating things within just the department. So the different jobs that you do, how much seniority, how much tenure do you have within that particular department. Classification actually assigns seniority based upon how long you've had a specific job. So in the instance of, my mom, again, she's never worked as a mail carrier, but if you looked at something like mail carriers within the post office, and you looked at their specific job classification, which mail carriers, mail deliverers, have the most seniority, right? And that would be based upon, how many days they've worked in that particular position. Another instance when it talks to, when we talk about this issue of seniority is bumping, which means that employees that have greater seniority, whose jobs are being phased out or downsized or they've been laid off, they actually have the right to displace workers with less seniority, even if they are less qualified within a particular job. So let's say that we're talking about classifying mail carriers in terms of their seniority within their job classification, which would be all the mail carriers. My mom's worked for the post office for 30-some years. She could potentially bump somebody out of a mail carrier position because of her seniority, because she has greater seniority there, if her job were to be displaced or if, her job were to be cut, which that has actually happened before. And the post office definitely uses this instead of bringing somebody up that's within the same job classification. If somebody has greater seniority, they can bump other people out, which means the post office has to pay thousands of dollars for extra training. This actually just happened with my mom very recently. It's how she got her current job. And the post office spent, thousands of dollars to send her to, where did she go? I think she went to Utah, or I think that was where she went for her training. tons of money, and they could have just promoted somebody that was already in that job classification, but she was able to bump somebody out of that position.